Good morning and welcome to today's Q&A, which is the March Q&A and the first one here on Patreon. So I still have to figure some things out, but I hope that this could develop into a bit of a community thing. Thank you for being a Patreon, for choosing to be here, and thank you also for all the questions that you submitted. It was lovely to see that people started introducing themselves under the post where I asked for your questions, and sort of a bit of a interaction started. So maybe in the future we could try doing a live stream that could be a bit more interactive, but I have not done one of those yet, so I'll have to figure that out too. I'll go through the questions in the order in which they came in, and I'll try to answer as much as I can, but some were very broad, so I don't know how well I can answer them without making this Q&A a couple of hours long. So if there is something, like if you would like to ask something more in depth, then you can do it, always do it in next month, in the next Q&A. Okay, so let's get to it. First question was from Aki, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing. If I am, sorry. I want to ask, how did you find your living place garden? What was the most important thing? We'll move out from our current place next year, and I want to have my own garden. Well, my answer is very much specific to my circumstances. I live in the Netherlands, which is a very small and very densely populated country. So buying a plot here is very expensive. For us, it's not possible to buy land that we could live on, where you are allowed to build a house in the size that, like our plot. Our plot is 1/4 of an acre, but it's 5 kilometers away from our house, and it's land that has a designation for growing, for landbouw, agriculture. So that makes it affordable for us. We could not have a house with a garden that big in the Netherlands. Our backyard is very small. It's just 5 meters wide and maybe 25 long, with some space taken up by a shed too. So it's very small, but some people in the Netherlands would consider this a big garden. So when we were buying our house, which is almost 20 years ago, it's almost 20 years ago, for me the most important thing was the size of the garden. So basically we bought the largest garden that we could afford in our price range. And another thing that I was concerned with was whether there was the soil was not polluted, because the Hengelo where we live is quite an industrial city. There was a lot of industry in the past, still is, and in a lot of places the soil can be polluted, which would make it unsuitable for growing edibles, of course, and that was my goal. So there were the two main things. When we bought our plot, which I talked about, the 1/4 acre plot, that's on a site where there had been allotments since the end of the 60s, organic allotments. So the soil had been improved, but we started by renting an allotment there, and then in 2015 we got the opportunity to buy a 1,000 square meters 1/4 acre plot, and for us that was a dream come true. But we were not that. For us, like, finding the location was secondary. That was just, we were so happy that we could get this. And that it was also a site where we knew that the soil had been treated reasonably well in the past decades. But if you do have a choice, then there are certain things to look for. I'm not sure where you are, Aki, so maybe please comment below. Well, ideally, you would want, if you want to grow edibles, you would want a land that is gently sloping to the south for good sun exposure. You would want it to be protected from too much wind, but of course you can plant windbreaks for that, or create some kind of windbreak, and there are questions about that further on. You would want soil that is fertile, so loamy soil would be ideal. and it's great if you have some access to water. Okay, next question is from CA, who lives in Windsor, southwest of London, and she has a question about pollination in honeyberries and why her honeyberries are not producing, even though she has several varieties. They look growing well, and 2 varieties at the moment, and when they flowered there were lots of bees. So usually if your plants are growing well and happy, then the problem will be with pollination. You're saying there are enough pollinating insects. That could be a problem. That would be a question that I would ask, but since you're saying there are enough pollinators, then it's not the problem. So the only thing remaining is that the 2 varieties that you have are not compatible. And the pollination in honeyberries is a bit complicated, more complicated than in other fruits. There are incompatibilities. So since you do not know what variety you have, then the only thing would be just to add a couple of more varieties and hope that there will be a pollinator in them. That's basically the only thing you can try. So if you have the space, just look up some other good varieties, and I have a video on honeyberries and some varieties that I would recommend. Daniel asks about whether I add any other organic amendments to our soil other than compost. At the moment, no, we only use compost because since we have a lot of waste, green waste from organic waste also from our food forest part of the garden, then we are able to generate enough compost for our vegetable beds, and we add about 2 wheelbarrows to every bed in spring. But our soil is sandy, and sandy soil is generally not inherently very fertile, much less so than clay, which is more capable of holding on to nutrients. So I do use things like fermented comfrey feed and fermented nettles for certain hungry vegetables like squash or cabbages. Another question from Daniel is whether I use living mulch in the garden. Not in the vegetable garden, because when you have living mulch, it does interfere with, you have to work around it. And because I try to do 2 to 3 different things in every bed during a season, that would make things complicated for us. You are also not able to sow directly if you have living mulch on your beds. So that's the reason why I don't do it. It's not because I don't think the idea does not have merit. I think if you have more space and are less limited or less concerned with using the space very effectively, then it's certainly worth trying. The next question is from Louise, who is in Denmark, I think she says, and she has a question about saving seed from flowers, from Helichrysum monstrosum, and whether you can keep the color even though she has grown different colors next to each other. I do not know specifically about flowers, but usually, mostly the same things apply as from vegetables. In most things, cross-pollination will occur if you do not try to prevent it, and that will affect the results. But the stakes here are very low, so I think you could just go for it and try and see what happens. Just save the seed and then see what colors you get. When I save seeds from my cut flowers, and I have grown lots of cut flowers. At one point, we even have a 100 square meter garden with perennial cut flowers. Often in annuals, I just sort of let it happen, and things will change over time. Like, for example, if you have some interesting varieties of calendula, and it will sort of return back to the more normal colors over time if you let itself so. But again, I would just try. I have a book about seed saving, which is about seed saving in vegetables. It's called Zelfzaden telen, but it's in Dutch, but it's been translated from English, and in English it's called How to Save Your Own Seeds. And I think it's an excellent introduction to the topic, and it talks about all of the things that you need to know. If you want to be sure that no cross-pollination occurs, then you would have to do things like build cages with insect netting. So that gets quite complicated. Also, I have a few book recommendations for you, since you're also saying that you would like to start selling cut flowers. These are two books that I think are really interesting on the topic: Flowers for Sale and The Flower Farmer, which is really excellent. And they also deal with things like marketing your cut flowers, so that might be interesting. And another more specialty thing is woody cut stems for growers and florists. So if you have enough space, then it might be interesting to add some bushes like that, because it would also prolong the season in which you can offer things for sale. Okay, then there was another question from Louise whether I start seeds indoors, and that she has problems with dampening off when she does that. Yes, I do start a lot of seeds on the windowsill. I have a heated propagator for things like a really small heated propagator. You can also use heating mats for things that require more worms to germinate, like chilies and aubergine, or even winter squash will germinate better and faster if you provide some a bit more worms than than we get in our house generally in spring. But dampening off is usually, the problem is usually like if you water too much, or the soil is too cold and too wet. So the thing is to calibrate your watering carefully. That's the main thing to do. And also what you can do is adding something to the potting mix to aerate it and improve the drainage, like vermiculite or perlite. So that's the things that you could try. But mostly it's the problems are usually a combination of too low temperatures and too much water. And then last question is by Louise, is about what can she plant as a windbreak to the west of her garden, and she is in a coastal region in zone 6. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is buckthorn, which produces those orange, very acidic but also extremely rich in vitamin C berries, and it's native to our coast, and the coast of Denmark, I presume, is the same thing. So those are plants that can take a lot of wind and also salt the wind, so the wind coming from the sea. If you want to grow it, you need one male plant per 5 or 6 female plants. And the cheapest option is to use the native, the wild plants. But there are some improved cultivars that have larger berries with a bit better taste, so that might be interesting to look into. Then there are some questions from Daniela, who is in the Netherlands, and she would like to know what are some sources of high quality products like dirt and seeds. I have already told you when you asked that directly, that I would recommend Bolster, which is a Dutch seed company specialized in biodynamic seeds, and my experience with them has been very good. They have varieties that are very well suited to our climate, and the seed is usually of a very good quality. For soil or potting mixes, stuff like that, if you want it organically, boerengoed.nu. I will put that in the under this post. That sells also organic soil amendments, but also potting mixes and compost and things like that. Another question: what would you recommend as a nice and easy trellis that also looks good? I think the thing that looks most pretty in the garden are teepees made out of, or structures made out of willow or hazel. They're also pretty easy to build, and you can grow things like winter squash, small fruited winter squash on them, or sweet peas. They're beautiful for that. I have done this in the past many years, also in the community garden, but last few years we've been using, I think for the last 2-3 years, we're using trellis that we built following a tutorial by Patrick Dolan from One Yard Revolution channel, and it's very sturdy. It's made out of, the trellis is made out of concrete remesh, and it's super easy to use, but there is some investment at the beginning in the materials. So if you were willing to do that, they last for ages and they're very sturdy. We even grew winter squash on them that had fruits like 5 kilo. So, and it was perfectly fine. Also, another one by Danielle about hardening of plants and whether you can do it without greenhouse. Yes, that's no problem. Our greenhouse is on our plot, and I don't start any seedlings there because seedlings need attention basically daily. And at this moment, I only go once or twice to the garden. So I start everything on the windowsill and I harden it off in my backyard just by taking the plants outside for prolonged periods of time. There's nothing more to it. And another one from Danielle, what should she plant for the different layers of a food forest if she does not know whether she will still be living in her house in 5 years? Well, for the 3-layer, even trees on dwarfing rootstock take 2 to 3 years to start producing at all, and then 5 years to give you a bit more substantial harvest. So even dwarfing rootstock might not be a great idea for you, but there are lots of things for the bush layer. Like I would do things like currants and gooseberries, which start producing in their 2nd year usually, and in 3 years you can get a pretty good harvest already. And they're also very easy to move. So if you will be moving with the Netherlands, you can easily take your plants with you. And last, Danielle asked what can she plant in a north side of dark brick wall, whether there are edibles for this situation. Well, that gets tricky because there are few edible plants that will produce without like, it does not need to be direct sun, but you need good light. So we have against the north wall of our house, 2 things that come to mind is Schisandra. I am not sure what's the English name, but it's a climber that produces red berries with a little peculiar taste. And from the easier ones, I have good experience with Japanese wineberry and loganberry, but even those do need good indirect light. So I don't know what the space that you're talking about looks like. And another evergreen edible hedges. That is also tricky. There are a few edible plants that are evergreen. That's usually I get that question a lot, like what can I plant that will be evergreen and also produce fruits. Basically 2 bushes that I know will grow here are the strawberry tree, and that is not a reliable producer in our climate because it flowers before winter. So if the winter is too harsh, then it will not produce, but it is a very pretty, very ornamental bush. And another one is Elaeagnus ebbingei, which is very hardy, but again, it flowers before winter and produces berries in April. And I have a video about that one if you want to know more. Okay, then there's a question from Natalia about whether when you design gardens, do you test soil pH and do you correct it? Would you test it again afterwards? In my garden, pH varies from 5 to 7, and I think to correct it at the more acidic parts, but I'm afraid to overdo it. I do not usually test the soil, even if I'm designing for clients, because I can read the plants in the Netherlands, the wild plants. So I can usually see from what is growing in a garden, I can estimate what the acidity is. And that's not, of course, terribly precise, but it gives me a good idea. And a lot of plants are quite tolerant. Like even edible plants like currants and gooseberries and stuff are pretty tolerant. If the pH is very extreme, like very acidic, it's not a very ecological approach to try to drastically alter the soil that you have. And if you want to amend it with calc, what is it in English? Sorry, like for to amend acidity, that's not a one-time thing that you have to repeatedly apply it to. It's not like you can use a lot and then be done with it. You would have to apply a bit. So you can try that. Another thing is if you're adding well-composted organic materials to the soil, it also acts as a buffer and it will sort of mellow the pH, the extremity of it. Because even things like needles from spruces and other trees that are very acidic when they're fresh, once they're composted, they become close to neutral. So they will also sort of buffer and mellow the pH of the soil. Okay, I hope that helps a bit. The last questions are from Mimi, who is also in the Netherlands and has a garden where she's trying to grow a lot of edibles and also plants for their goats. And her first question is, what should I plant under bushes and trees? Right now I'm only mulching with hay or chips, and that she's been researching edible plants for under trees. So tips for shadow areas. Well, there are few edible plants that will grow in true shade, but the shade cast by trees and bushes is also seasonal, and if you have fruit trees, they're usually not as dense as some other trees. So you get a sort of dappled shade, and a lot of things can grow in part shade. Also, if your trees are very young, they're probably not casting that much shade. The herb layer of a food forest is the part that will change the most over the years, because the trees will mature, will cast more shade, and then some plants will not grow that well anymore. But there are also plants that do need a bit of shade to thrive, so the composition of your herb layer should change a bit to reflect that. I will just couple of things that grow in part shade and are edible. Hostas are great. Things like lungwort is good. It also has pretty flowers early in the season. From the perennial vegetables, I think Gudkin Henry is one of the most shade tolerant. There are also plants that grow very early in the season, like ramsons, that appear before the trees develop leaves and cast shade. So they're sort of genetically suited to that, to growing under trees. So those are just a few suggestions. Also, wild strawberries, for example, or ostrich fern can tolerate a lot of shade and needs a bit of, will appreciate a bit damp soil. So those are some of the things just from top of my head. But if you have further questions, then you can ask them later. Another thing you ask is about dahlias, whether you can grow dahlias planting them under a not edible tree, maybe under some trees. Again, that depends on how much shade exactly there is. You can also try putting the plants to the south of the trees, where they will get more direct sunshine, but dahlias are not suited to very shady conditions. So if it's like a dappled shade, part sun, some of the part of the day, then you can try it. Also interesting, dahlias are not only beautiful, as you read, they are also edible. Both the petals and the tubers are edible. And another one, we have just started to plant Elagnus ebbingei along the fence. Unfortunately, some plants were damaged during transport. Do you know whether I can grow some cuttings? I guess it's not the right time of the year. No, it's not ideal time of the year. For cuttings, you would need semi-ripe cuttings, and you would take those in the summer. But, like you're saying, they're damaged during transport. How damaged they are? Because I don't know how much damage the plants sustained. Plants like this could often recover. So if you have roots that are intact, then you might still try planting them. I would probably just try. So I think I have now gone through all the questions. If I forgot something, I apologize, and please do ask again. Or if there's something that I answered too broadly or not in depth enough, then please ask again next time. I'll be opening a new Q&A in about 3 weeks so that I can film another one around mid-April. Otherwise, that's all from me today. And I would like to thank you again for being here, for being a Patreon and supporting my work. And I do love how this is this opportunity to connect with you a little bit more directly. So happy gardening and see you next time.